Started then. So this is an interview with Dillon Mysliwiec, pronounced correctly, a wee bit of practice. And we're going to be talking about, I've kind of changed it about, I told people in Ben's Business Book Club it will be about marketing and psychology of persuasion, but I've decided we're going to be talking about, and I defined it with more clarity, rewiring your mind for success, which is exactly what myself and Dillon have managed to do over years of pushing ourselves through reading and personal development to turn our lives around. And we've got a very similar journey. So I found Dillon's journey very fascinating. We're both into digital marketing. So we know each other through Instagram. We connected.
Yeah.
And yeah, I post a lot of stories over there. And we're always commenting back and forward on each other's stories and post on social media, probably about books. And that's how we ended up connecting, just by being very aligned with each other, having the same goals and going in the same direction. You've also been on the rise, just coming from a job you didn't like to actually take action and to start the process of leaving your work. But what actually happened was through the restructure. Yeah. Through restructuring and reading and studying the books, you maybe became uninterested in the job that you're actually in, and you were fired anyway. So you went into and took the plunge and the jump into entrepreneurship and started structuring your own life and starting your business and your ventures that you're into now. So it'd be interesting to hear how you're creating a life for yourself, a more meaningful one on your terms. And one thing I wanted to add as well about how this podcast came together is I posted a question up to Ben's Business Book Club to ask if anyone had any questions about something, and I went to contact you to give you some advice on that, and then I realized that you knew quite a lot, and I knew you'd been studying. It was just interesting to hear your replies, because I knew you knew something. And then the tables turned, and Dillon ended up started teaching me a bunch of things I never knew. And we had a really interesting conversation. So I was like, let's do a Facebook Live on Ben's Business Podcast this Wednesday. And here we are. So do you want to give another introduction and go into I've hopefully given you a good enough introduction, but you can go into that a wee bit further and touch on parts I've maybe missed that I don't know about you. But the one thing that I really find interesting and fascinating is the story on how you started to turn your life around. And it reminds me of my own story. But you mentioned that you've lost a lot of weight. If you can give us the exact details of what you actually done to do that, because I'm sure there's other people who have similar goals. And on top of that, you'd racked up some debt or whatever. And things like that, just simple issues that we get ourselves in. And people have reached rock bottom, how they can turn their life around, how you done it. And yeah, tell us a story around that and how all that came together.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically about, I want to say 3.5 years ago now, I ended up, at a job where I kept trying to make changes. I showed up every day with a button up, a tie, slacks, and dress shoes, because I was like, yeah, I'm gonna make it big. I'm gonna move up the ladder. And basically every step of the way, if I came up with an idea that if I discovered would save the company money, I would get shut down here and there, and it got demoralizing after a while. And so one day I'm on YouTube, as most hardworking employees are, and essentially what ended up happening was I wasn't allowed to have Google Chrome, so I couldn't have ad blocker. And one day I get that ad that most people who don't have ad blocker have seen. Hey, I'm here in my garage, from Ty Lopez. Mm-hmm. And I'll admit he's a bit salesy, but his pitch on reading was very persuasive. And so every position I got sat in the office, I was always not facing anyone because I was never on a team. I got hired as a contractor. And once I finally got into the final seat I'd get in before actually becoming a full-time employee, I sat across from somebody who was over a cubicle wall, and essentially I just started chatting with him, and it turns out he was very antisocial, and it seems that I attract those people, because even though I'm very extroverted, most of my best friends are actually antisocial, so it's quite humorous that he ended up sitting right there. So I ended up chatting with him about, this guy I keep seeing in these ads, and how I keep, hearing about, how reading changed his life. And I started talking with him, and it turns out he actually is, at least was at one point a very avid reader. And he actually, I think, went to school for maybe mechanical engineering, but he ended up as a nuclear engineer and then an electrical engineer and even a programmer. And so I was like, that's crazy. Like, he taught himself a lot of these other skills. And so after a little while, he ended up telling me, he's like, I have this whole collection of digital books, and I think I have a couple audio books. I'm like, I can't stand those, e-readers, but I'll give the audiobook a try. And so he ended up having two of the best self-help books I've ever read. And I got them like right when I needed them. And the first one was The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And before he even begins to dive into the habits, he explains how essentially you need to learn to accept new things like this. And the way that we go through change when we believe one thing, but we need to believe another in order to succeed, is we have what's called a paradigm shift. And I'm literally on my way to work about a year and a half, maybe, after starting my job. And all of a sudden, like, as he's discussing what an aha moment is, which is an instantaneous paradigm shift where everything you once believed switches to something else. And I literally, on my way to work, I remember that happening. And I was just blown away. I'm like, holy crap, like, this is what's been in books. Like, I haven't been, I had never read any full-length book in my entire life. I used to forge my dad's signature on those must-reads for elementary and middle school. When I finally got to high school, I never did the summer reading. I was good enough in math and science. I didn't need to do well in English. I outweighed that with my other academics. And so I never really got into reading. I still remember there was one book we read in high school called The East of Eden, and there was only one chapter we didn't read in class, and we were supposed to read at home. So technically that would have been the first book I finished, but I didn't read that chapter at home. Yeah. I just couldn't get through books. But at that moment, as I'm listening to it on the ride home, or on the ride to work, I just was like, holy crap. And so I ended up finishing that audiobook in about 2 weeks, and I immediately popped in the other one, and another great classic. It was How to Win Friends and Influence People. And even though I've always been very, conversationalist, I've always been able to converse with anybody. It doesn't matter where they come from or what they like. I always have something to talk about. One of the big things that I realized, though, was there were certain ways that I was communicating that were off-putting. And so I slowly started adjusting those. And ironically, the more I adjusted those, I actually became more friendly with other people in the office, as well as just people I was networking with and meeting in general. And so after I finish, or I'm halfway through that second audiobook, and I'm like, you know what, I'll take the dive. I'll start getting into reading. And I remember picking up 4 books from Amazon. It's the first time I ever put money down on books that I cared about, other than being forced to buy books in college. Mm-hmm. And the first 4 books I got, I believe, were, what was it? Managing Oneself by Peter Drucker. It was a 54-page book. I'm like, can't hurt. I'm sure that'll be easy to get through. And then I got Confessions of an Advertising Man by David Ogilvy, and Tested Advertising, which I actually never even got through that entirely, so I don't remember the author's name. And then the 4th book I got was Sam Walton's Made in America, which I actually keep up on a shelf over my desk as motivation.
Yeah, but it's a great book.
Yeah, so basically what ended up happening was I read Managing Oneself, and it talks about how people learn differently and how you should learn how you learn. And one of the big things I realized was at one point, reading wasn't my thing. I did not gain any extra knowledge from reading. And so that was the biggest thing, biggest fault that I had in school, was that people were trying to teach me through reading, and that's not how I learned. I learned through actually being interactive in the class. Like, that's the reason why I killed it in math class. They would start drawing something on the board, and I'd answer the question before she asked it, and I'd get kicked out of class. Like, just go wander the halls, until I finish with this. So yeah. That's always how I was, until, like I said, I realized what I could actually gain from books, like what knowledge there was available. And so that was how my initial reading journey began. With those 4 books. And like I said, one of them I didn't even finish, but I did finish the first 3, and now I've finished over, I think, 75 books in the last 3 years. And based on, I think, like the national statistic, the average person reads 1 book a year. So I'm doing pretty good for myself and up to, I guess, most 75-year-olds.
Yeah.
Yeah, and essentially the other big thing that happened too, and probably the one thing that made me susceptible to wanting to learn something new was coincidentally, my aunt likes to take a lot of pictures at family events. And what ended up happening one day was she got me at it was a pool party for, I believe it was somebody's graduation. I still know the picture because I still have it today. I think it's even in my Instagram feed, where basically I was not happy with the way I looked. And not only that, she got me while I had like a bowl of Jello in my hand with like Cool Whip on the top of it. And I'm like, that is not something I want to be showboating anywhere.
Yeah.
So what ended up happening was I saw that and I immediately started, I started looking into, the best ways to lose weight. And it actually turns out that one of the best habits to form in order to lose weight is not, making sure you go to the gym every day. It's not just eating healthy. It's simply recording what you eat. And by doing so, you mentally tell yourself like, wow, this is what I'm doing to myself. And that was a big, blow to the head. Is like, holy crap, like this is what I've been consuming. I've been consuming twice the daily recommendations, even for myself, since, the daily recommendations like 2,000 on average, but per person it's different. And even for someone, my age, height, weight, I think I can consume 26 to 2,800 calories, and I was well beyond that. And that was aside from the fact that I wasn't exercising. I hadn't done sports in years. I hadn't been hitting the gym. I hadn't been running, hadn't been biking. And so I first started off by just simply, recording what I was eating. And the way that I kept track of it, there was an app. It was once called Lyft, and now it's called Coach.me. And essentially, it's just a habit tracker. It's like, did I do this today? Swipe, right? And every day that you do it, it'll give you, it'll be like, oh, you're on a 5-day streak, right? And so that was my goal, was to just not break that streak. So I had this other way that motivated me to keep track of what I was eating. And so it wasn't just like, oh, I got to do it. It's like, oh, I get to hit the swipe, right? And unbeknownst to myself, I was creating the reward for my habit loop. And by doing that, I just continually got reinforced, and to the point where I was enjoying writing it down, even when I forgot to check it off.
Yeah.
And
could I add a couple of lessons for the viewers and the listeners? It's the same, like when we're thinking about business, because the podcast is about business as well, but we're wanting to use this story as well as like a way to get lessons. So like if you record what you're eating every day, the same happens when you do that, when you record what you're doing in business every day and see why you're not successful yet. So it's the same idea. The same habits almost are exactly the same in every area of life. You just have to bring that lesson over into business and every other area of your life. And I just wanted to add that on, that recording what you eat is very similar to recording what you're actually doing on your timetable and your daily activities.
Yeah, a very, very coincidental thing that I did was I'll say probably about 3 years ago, I actually ended up also trying to figure out like, oh, how can I get more reading and how can I get more learning in? Because that was one of the things, again, that Tai Lopez guy is like, oh yeah, people say they don't have any time. And I was like, well, where is my time? I was curious, like where was I actually spending my time? So I downloaded an app. It's called A Time Logger 2, I think. And essentially, every single day, I record exactly what I do. It's like, oh, I wait. So I record when I sleep. When I wake up, it's like I have a getting ready, option. And basically, you can create as many things as you want and specify it or broaden it however you'd like. But I essentially summed it up to like, this is when I was at work, this is when I was on break, this is when I was eating lunch, etc. And I realized that at one point I was like, holy crap, I'm playing like hours and hours of video games just a day, let alone in a week or a month. And I was like, there's one thing I can cut back. Like I don't even have to remove it. I could just cut it back. If I just removed 1 hour of that every day, I'd have an hour to read, or I have an hour to, work on just myself with, taking online courses, whatever it was. And so I ended up seeing that and ultimately started changing that. So it's very interesting because I have an entire record of almost everything I've done for the last 3 years in this app.
Yeah.
And so, you know, and obviously, like if I went on something like vacation, I would just hit vacation and I wouldn't track it. It was the download time. It was time to
Right.
relax. But it was very interesting to start seeing that, oh, like if I just do a little here, a little there, I can start adding more. And one of the big things I did was I added reading to every one of the breaks I had at work. So while I'm at work, I get one 10-minute break in the morning, one 10-minute break in the afternoon, and then I get a 45-minute lunch break. I'm like, I can eat lunch in 15 minutes, so there's a half-hour section of reading. And so every day, I was going to get, you know, roughly 50 minutes of reading. And because I slowly stopped liking my job, I got 55 minutes, an hour, maybe an hour, 10
Yeah.
minutes, just because I would slowly just be sneaking in some more reading and or just overlapping the time that I should get back to work.
Yeah.
And so that was a big thing, was just simply tracking what I was doing, so I was aware, because most of the reason people fall into these bad habit loops is because they're unaware of what they're actually doing. And the second you become aware of it, it's very powerful for what you can do. I think I mentioned you on our phone call, like something simple I did just to test if I could break certain habits was adjusting the way I write the letter A. Like instead of the
Oh yeah.
standard like circle and line, I'm like, let me try to do the curled top in the circle. And after about a month and a half, now it's like I've been doing that since I was 5 years old. And now I forget that when I want to write it the other way, I actually have to think about it because I erased
Hmm.
that habit. And
Yeah.
because you write all the time, if you actually, well, not everyone writes, but I write a lot. And because of that, it was so impactful that like it almost erased something I knew since I was 5. That's like pretend erasing learning how to ride a bike. Like that's
Yeah.
powerful, like what you can do with your brain.
Hmm.
And one of the big things I learned through a lot of research, not through books necessarily, although I do have a book I need to get to, is that our brains are plastic. It was once thought like, oh, if you have a drink, you're killing brain cells and neurons don't grow back. But it turns out your brain, as long as it's utilized, actually can grow back very rapidly, and you can even alter how your brain is shaped. You can make it so that there's more connections one way than another, and remove connections to bad things. And that's how you
Hmm.
get habit loops to begin with. Is you get a set of patterns that are created in your brain to make something easier to do. And so that's how you create the habit. It's not necessarily that you want to do it. It's the fact that it's the least amount of energy your brain can use will do the thing that's easiest. And the easiest thing usually ends up being something bad unless you control it.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so after I started that weight loss journey, and then all of a sudden I started picking up books along the way, and now I'm losing weight and I'm starting to read. All of a sudden I realized like, wow, I'm not a fan of working for somebody else. Like the fact that if I have a good idea, the only thing that's stopping me is someone just saying no. I was like, I'm not okay with that.
Yeah.
And so basically I decided from that point, I'm like, I'm definitely never going to work for someone else again. I'm going to stay at this job. Because I have debt. I can't just quit. One of my biggest things, and the only reason I didn't quit, was I'm one of 5 siblings. And if I had quit, I would be, or when I was employed, I was the only one that had a steady income. So
Okay.
one thing I wanted to make sure was that if they ever needed anything, they could just come to me because I could help them out. I
Yeah.
was working as an engineer. I made plenty of money. I didn't need to worry about, finances. I still had debt, but I was paying it off at a relatively quick rate. Didn't need to worry about that. And so what ended up happening was, while I started, basically delineating away from work and focusing more on basically myself, I slowly also showed signs of that to some people at work, but apparently not to everyone, because at one point I even actually got promoted during this little movement of mine.
Yeah.
And so along this whole journey, one of the big things I took up after reading was I took up online courses, and I started just teaching myself random stuff like programming, web design. And I knew a little bit about web design, but I wasn't sufficient enough that I could comfortably go to someone and be like, yeah, that'll be $1,200 for a website. I'd be like, I really hope I can build this website, let alone you paying me for it.
Yeah.
And so then I ended up coming across probably one of the most impactful and powerful books for productivity, which is called The One Thing, which I know you're doing the 66-day challenge from.
Yeah.
And
Day 10 of getting up at 4:45.
very nice. I got to day 10.
I consider myself as an insomniac, so that's pretty good going. And the 66-day challenge works, yeah.
And so that was one of the things, is that when I first got through that book, I didn't think about, doing like the 66-day challenge or anything like that. But I really did ask the question, the focusing question, which is, what is the one thing I can do such that by doing it, everything else will become easier or unnecessary to achieving my goal? And so there's a whole packet that you can print out right off their website, and it's the goal setting to the now. And so I started with my someday goal, which was like, I want absolute financial freedom. I want it to the point where I can wake up, do nothing, and go to sleep and make enough money to have everything that I want. Not so that I can just veg out, but the main reason I wanted to do it was actually so that I could then do other things, like start another business, help my family, help a charity, do whatever I want to actually work on by having freedom of time. And
Yep.
so I slowly started building skills that I knew eventually could convert into something like passive income. So creating a social media marketing company, by doing that, I could end up, getting clients. And once I get them completely in a system, I can then take someone else and be like, all right, you handle their website, you handle their Facebook ads, and I'll just be the overwatcher. And, I learned a few other things that I could get into at a different time. But basically, I learned a lot of various ways that you can make recurring revenue without having to put in a lot of active time. And so one of the things I really got from that book was like, focus on one thing. And what ended up happening was February of 2017. So rewind about, I think it was September of 2015, I started picking up martial arts. And that definitely was a huge impact on my life. It was like a combination of working out, as well as basically a stress reliever, a focusing, almost meditative practice, because you have to be very focused to do a lot of the things that we work on. I take Jeet Kune Do for anybody out there that's curious. It's very much like an MMA style fighting. You fight on various realms. It's not like just grappling. It's not just striking like boxing, right? So it helped a lot with just focus and all of that. And what ended up happening was I'm sparring with my my uke, or my sparring partner, and he ends up tossing me, and me being myself, I'm like, oh, I'm going to try to reverse it, even though I'm the one in the air right now. I end up taking him and toppling us both on top of my shoulder. And what ended up happening was I immediately, like, I'm like, yep, tap. Like, I'm very much, I'm not like accustomed to pain, but I don't react how most people do. I usually laugh it off no matter how bad it is. And immediately I was laying on the ground. I'm like, oh, this is going to hurt tomorrow. And so I go to sit up, and I realize my arm didn't really come with me. It kind of like just hung there. And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, this is not going to be good. And as I end up, trying to stand up, I realized like this thing is just going to keep sliding. This thing hurts like hell. Luckily, it was the winter, so I had my sweatshirt there. I made probably one of the most comfortable slings I've ever had. Even the one the doctor gave me wasn't as comfortable as this. But I sling my arm up, and basically I think my Sifu ended up driving me home. He's just like, it was one of my classmates ended up driving me home, because they're like, we're not going to let you drive home. Like that looks like it hurts. So what ends up happening is I get home. First off, they were going to bring me to the hospital. I'm like, I'm not paying ER bills to go for a popped out shoulder. It's probably just a dislocated shoulder. So I get home and I Google videos of how to pop my shoulder back in, and I'll go to get an x-ray tomorrow morning at like urgent care or something like that. And so I look him up. I have my cousin here, and he basically helps me, repositions it, and I feel it. I feel it pop right in, and instantly I feel great. I'm like, oh, that's awesome. Like, I thought this was going to be terrible. And so I raise my arms up. I'm like, yes, perfect. And the second I let go of my shoulder muscle, I just fell to my knees with pain. It was one of the most I felt like someone just stabbed me in the shoulder.
Yeah.
What I would later find out is not only did I dislocate my shoulder, I also separated my AC joint, and I fractured my clavicle. And so basically I was out of commission for like 3 to 4 months, no martial arts, which I
Yeah.
do 6 hours a week. And so
Right.
it
Yeah.
and that's a low estimate. It was actually usually more, because on Friday nights we'd go for a couple extra hours. But essentially, you know, I'm like, what do I do with this extra time? And I just finished the one thing. It was the most odd scenario that I happened to have finished that book right there. And so what I ended up doing was, I'm like, all right, I'll figure out what it is, the one thing I should do. And after breaking it all down, I realized one of the ways I could make recurring revenue was creating WordPress templates. So I'm like, all right, well then I need to become a WordPress developer. I got to take my skills and bring it to this table.
Yeah.
So I end up taking this online course. I think it's 28.5 hours, which is the equivalent of a single semester of classes, or a little bit more in like an actual school. And this particular course was absolutely phenomenal. If anyone's curious, I can send a link to it. But I ended up plowing through it in like a month, maybe a month and a half. And then all of a sudden I went from like, you know, I knew how to do web design pretty good now, up to the point where like, wow, I'm a professional WordPress developer. Like I know
Yeah.
how to do everything on the back end of WordPress now. And that immediately opened up many opportunities. Like that one skill alone, I've been able to make, I think now 6 or 7 WordPress sites, you know, getting me a few $1,000s just for this one skill. And that
Yeah.
was undercharging what I could have. Like a normal WordPress developer for a single site can charge like minimum like $2,000. And I was being nice because I'm like, I want to get clients. I want to help people out. A lot of the times I was helping friends out as well, so I would cut it back by a lot. And so, you know, but basically that's what I got from that 3 months, is I just started focusing. I started taking more online courses. I got better at graphic design, better at logo design. I started getting more clients. And eventually my shoulder heals up. I get back to martial arts, you know, so I lose those well, my shoulder heals up. It's still, you know, still got a nice little lump right here that'll probably never go away.
All
But
right.
essentially I'm capable of moving again. And after all that, so I lose my 6 hours of, you know, study time, but I slowly, you know, just start increasing my reading time. And
Right.
finally I start getting through books that, you know, I got a lot of business books at first, like, oh, you should read this one, like 0 to 1. But I'm like, it was a great book, but it's not helping me now. I'm not creating the next big app. I'm not inventing something new. So a lot of it wasn't highly applicable to me, until I started eventually getting into psychology books. And that was one of the biggest impacts I could have had. Essentially, instead of going into, you know, how can I specifically make a business better, it's like, what's like the mindset, you know, that you need to have for yourself in order to even run a business? What's the mindset of your customers that you're trying to help to begin with? You know,
Yeah.
eventually I want to get into business consulting, and I've actually done a little bit of that already, but not to the extent that I'd wish. But with that business consulting, I don't go in and basically go, oh, you're running your business wrong. You know, I try to connect with them and figure out why they even think their business should be run that way. And
Yeah.
so definitely, of all the books that I've read, I've read from, you know, standard self-help to, you know, productivity to general knowledge, like some book like Freakonomics, although to be honest, that also kind of delves a little into psychology and how to think differently.
Yeah.
You know, I've been into business, marketing, advertising, philosophy, and of all of those books, the biggest one, or the ones that have had the biggest impact on me, have been the psychology books, purely
Yeah.
because now I understand, like when someone gets mad at me, I'm not like, why are they mad at me? Instead, I'm like, oh, I can connect the dots, but I don't get mad anymore. To
Yeah.
the point where, like, don't get me wrong, everyone gets mad, so I still get mad. I'll get mad on like Rocket League if someone's kicking my ass or something like that, but not to
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
extent that a lot of people still do, where they get frustrated because somebody left a
Reactive.
shoe in the hallway. Yeah, exactly. Where it's like, oh,
Yeah.
somebody messed up something I wasn't used to. I'm mad, right? Change. And
Yeah.
so that's a big thing that I see a lot of people fall prey to. And after changing that mindset, the best thing that happened wasn't actually just to me, but it was to my environment. And not because I had a different outlook and I'm looking through rose-colored glasses, or whatever the saying is. It's because I noticed that people around me actually started to change. People were more open to me. People would start, you know, telling me more things about what they're doing. I actually ended up getting 2 or 3 clients from work because they just wanted to converse with me. And so one thing for anybody who is currently working a day job and they're trying to get out to do their own side business, the one thing I recommend is don't just quit. Like, build yourself up the whole time. It's okay to go slow, because like eventually sometimes you need the push. Like for me, I definitely got to the point where I felt like I was beyond ready, and I'm just like, I just need to pay off my debt first. Like that's what I need to do. But I knew I was lying to myself. And I'm glad that somebody else got to push me, because it felt a lot better, and I got paid for that push. So, but one of the big things that, like I said, that people changing around me that really happened was I even noticed family members changing around me. One of the biggest examples I noticed was like my dad. I know that he always meant good things. He always had good intentions for me, but obviously we'd fight. But sometimes I feel like the fights were much more than they needed to be. They're very unnecessary for the lesson he was actually trying to teach. And over the last few years, even my brothers have noticed this, like much calmer demeanor, much more relaxed. And I know that also comes a bit with age, but it was like such a noticeable swing in the last few years, even though there's been other events that could have caused that swing before, and it didn't. And then I noticed one day my mom even asked me. I think everyone was like fighting during Christmas, because that's what families do. And what ended up happening was she kind of asked me. She's like, "How do you do it?" And I'm like, "Do what?" It's like, "How do you just not give a shit?" And I'm like, "It's not that I don't give a shit. It's just I realize we all die one day." And I was like, like that was one of the most impactful things I had. One of the books, actually, I put it over here, was On the Shortness of Life. I don't know if that's there.
Oh, Seneca, yeah.
Yeah, and that that's a simple book. It's very short, and technically you don't even need to read all of this, because I think this is like 2 other essays in here, but by Seneca. But just realizing that there's no reason to get upset at things that aren't going to impact your life. Like, like that shoe in the hallway. Like, yeah, like, maybe you'll trip on it one day, but if you're aware that it could be there, then there's no reason to be upset about it. And you can always slowly change those habits. And if you try to force them, you won't even create the change you want. That's why one of the things I actually learned recently, another little psychology one, was from like Invisible Influence. I think it was this one, where essentially, that one combined with Drive. That one I'm currently finishing up. But one of the big things I picked up was that
Jonah Berger?
Jonah Berger. Yeah, he's the same author as Contagious. And I found this one at I think I was on my way to LA.
This guy.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
That's a very popular book. I've not read that, but I brought that up because I know that you've studied that one as well. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And it's a great book. But it's funny, because that's the whole reason I picked up Invisible Influence. Was I was traveling to LA. I was in the Chicago airport, and they have like a bunch of really good bookstores in that particular airport. And I'm walking by the same one I walked by the previous year, that I took a cool picture of it for Instagram. I think it's what was it? I used it for the background of Hooked, because it's a book that talks about creating essentially addicting apps, but instead I put a picture of books behind it, because like that's what I got addicted to. And there's worse things to be addicted to, so I feel good about that.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, essentially it talks about the fact that if you try to motivate people through the wrong means, you won't end up with the goal that you want. So like some people are like, "Oh, is it okay to give your kids an allowance?" It's like, it's okay, but one of the things that's interesting about that is that later when they're on their own, are they going to clean if they're not getting paid for it? Right? And that's like something that got embedded in me. Was when I was a kid, I didn't know what an allowance was till I was 14 years old. I didn't even realize people were getting paid by their parents. I kind of assumed that was part of the working on the house was part of the you get to live here and eat food. So that's at least what I was told. So, my motivation was simply just to not get yelled at one point. And because even though I wasn't the oldest, I was one of the most responsible, or I was the most responsible of my 5 siblings. So like I'd be the one that I woke up first to wake everyone up. I made everyone's lunches. I had the kitchen as my cleaning duty. Someone else had the living room, but if the living room wasn't clean, I ended up having to do it. So because of that, ironically, I ended up becoming super messy later, because I was like, finally, I don't have to clean after somebody. And then I realized I wasn't even cleaning up after myself. So it just became a disaster. So like, that's the thing, is you don't want to motivate people to do what you want, because you might win in the short run, but in the long run, you might not get the the ideal accomplishment that you were looking for. I think Gary Vaynerchuk talks about that, like always telling the truth, even though it might be bad in this moment, it might even make someone hate you right now, is better than lying and letting them figure out later. And he says the truth always ends in the best long-term result. And I love that.
I've always said that. I've always said the people who are brutally honest are the people we respect in the long run. And I just posted about that today. About the fool who gets angry at you because you told them the truth, or you correct them, and the wise man or woman will love you for telling you the truth and correcting them.
Yeah, that's a big one too, because there's a difference. Like some people are, they're like, what is it, the grammar Nazi? They're always chasing after you, like, oh, you didn't do this, and it's like, that's not really relevant. But one of the biggest things you should always look for is your, the 5 friends you hang out with the most. You want them to also be some of the most honest people, to the point where they're like, hey, like, at that thing we were at, you were kind of being a dick, right? Like you need those reality checks, because if they don't do it, then your ego floats away from you and you have no idea what you're doing in a situation, to the point where people become like almost afraid to tell you, because they're like, oh, like that's just who he is. Like you can't stop that. He'll get upset with you. And it's like, you don't want that.
That gives you amazing, as well as like learning your own self-awareness through yourself and your own actions. You have to learn it that way, and one good way to do that is journaling. But like that exterior way, where people are, the 5 people around you are honest people, you want to get those people around you often. And my dad does a very good job of that for me, so I've got that. But I do naturally attract to people who tell me the truth, because I don't get offended like most people. And I think people need to adapt the same idea, that taking the truth without getting offended, but grabbing the lessons out of it, is the most important thing you can do in those situations, rather than, oh, you hurt my feelings.
Yeah. Well, that's a big one that I had to learn. It wasn't that my feelings would get hurt, but I still am to a degree, but I was very argumentative. Like if I thought I knew something and I was certain of it, you couldn't convince me otherwise. Like I was very much like, no, like I read about this, I heard about this, I looked into videos about it. Like I know what I'm talking about. You need to do more research, and here's all the information, and you need to hear it all before you can talk again, kind of thing. And I was very aggressive like that. And not to the point where like I looked like I was angry or something. It was just like I always wanted to make sure, I'm like, no, like this is definitely right. Like you're wrong. And specifically after reading the How to Win Friends and Influence People, I actually, I have a little note I keep to myself. I'll slide this off. I got magnets here. Ironically, this actually, so it's this little piece of paper that has all the principles from that book.
Right. Yeah.
And it was something I found online. I think it's still pretty easy to find. But essentially, what happened one day was I actually had a client who, it was one of those things where like I knew I was right. Like I was actually correct. This guy had told me one thing and then asked for another. I think it was, I was doing web design, graphic design, and I think it was like creating stationery stuff for him. So like just all of that. And he ended up basically not giving me any information, which I then later learned a lot from, that I should have been the one asking for this information. But he basically gave me free reign to do something. I do all this work, and he basically is like, oh, that's not what I was looking for. And so what ends up happening is I have to redo it a bunch of times. He ends up calling me one day, or I think he was texting me one day, and I'm at work too, so I can't even do a lot of like actual work on his stuff right now. And he's trying to tell me how essentially like, oh, you had, we were supposed to get this done in a week. We were supposed to do this, supposed to do that. And honestly, I've been talking to my staff, and even they're like, we're thinking about getting somebody else. The thing he doesn't know is like I literally was just at his place of business while he wasn't there because I needed pictures. He was aware that I was doing that, but he didn't know that I had just gone there. And I ended up talking to the staff, and they loved me. Like they were all like, yeah, like this is awesome what you're doing. Like here's more information, etc. And the other big thing was, the timetable. Like I had finished everything by the time he needed it for when he gave it to me. So for example, it was like, oh, how quick do you think you can do this? I'm like, I can get it done in a week if I have these pieces of information, right? And I didn't get them until after that whole week had already passed. Yeah, he had finally he got me all the information the last day of the week and expected me to finish everything. So instead of getting all angry at this guy, which I was about to lose a bunch of money because he was paying me a decent amount for all this, I was literally, I'm in the middle of texting him like, what are you talking about? All this. I calmed down, I took a breath, and I look over, I'm like, all right, what? Because actually in my office, not my office, my cubicle, it was on my like right side of the wall. I had it pinned there. I just look over, I'm like, all right, what are some principles I could use right now? Because I really need them.
Yeah, yeah.
And I calm myself down. I'm like, you know what? You're right. I understand. Because then because the thing about those principles, it's not about persuading people. Like one of the biggest things I've come to like think about the more I learn about influence is I get very nervous that when I'm talking to somebody, I might accidentally like force them to think something just because I know certain triggers that'll make them think something. And so I try never to use that with anyone unless it's something like I'm trying to convince a family member to lose weight, because like that's not bad in any sense, right? Like, that's like the only time I'll try to persuade someone. But when I'm just trying to like put forth my my opinions, I don't try to persuade people. I just want them to know what I know, and then I want to know what they know, and then we can both change our mind or keep our opinions. And so basically, as I'm reading the principles,
George, could you get the charger for that?
Sorry. No problem. And as I'm reading the principles, I realize, like one of them is like, never tell them they're wrong, and realize that, they like, what was it? Nobody cares about how much you know until they know how much you care.
Just ask Gemma.
And that was like one of the biggest takeaways I got was I'm like looking at this and I'm going, oh man, like, yeah, I really like, I understand where he's coming from because he doesn't know what I know. Like he's not a web designer. He's not a graphic designer. He doesn't know how long it might take. And right now he's just a customer that wanted something by a date and, it didn't happen. So instead of, trying to turn the tables on him and prove to him he's wrong, which would have gotten nothing but both of us more upset, I calmed down. I'm like going through the principles. I'm like, all right, like I understand why you're upset. It's perfectly reasonable. Here's the things that, I really needed to do. I'm sorry I didn't communicate that better to begin with, et cetera. I hope we can still keep working together. And immediately, it was the coolest thing because after reading that book, because I had it, like I said, I had an audible form or audio form. And so as I was listening to the book, I remember them describing scenarios that were in the book, like the guy with the, they delivered wood and they were testing it. They're like, this wood is nothing like I wanted. And they're like, oh, we apologize. Like, it's our fault. Like, please describe like what was wrong so we could fix this in the future. And they're like, oh, you'll be lucky if you get anything in the future. And it's like, yeah, I totally understand. Like you guys, I understand this could hurt your business. Let's discuss this. And as the guy starts talking, he realizes, the customer, they start realizing like, oh, maybe I did mess up, because the guy was so nice. Yeah. He was so he's just like, what are you guys, mad about? Like, oh my God, like I just realized I'm the guy, I'm the asshole, right? And so, so what ended up happening was I send these text messages to this guy, and all of a sudden he immediately messaged me like, oh, awesome, like let's get this stuff done. Like completely 180. Like he was about to fire me as as a contractor for doing this work, and immediately is like, oh, how soon can we get this done? Like completely 180. And that one incident was definitely something that shaped how I deal with anybody now. Like I never try to push like the moment I see any form of hesitation or disbelief or just concern when I'm describing anything, I dial it right back. I'm just like, but like, oh, what do you think? Like, I want to know where their brain is going. And actually, one other little book, this one's not psychology. It's not directly psychology, but a great book that I actually learned a lot of those cues from to realize like, oh, hey, are they like understanding what I'm saying? Are they not agreeing? Are they uncomfortable? Was this one right here, What Every Body Is Saying by Joe Navarro. And fantastic book on body reading. He's a former FBI agent, and he talks about understanding how people move. And the fact that, like, a lot of people are like, oh, like, just put them up to a lie detector test. Lie detector test actually will show a positive to a plant if you set it up correctly. So lie detector tests actually aren't as effective as people think. They're only, on average, about 60% effective at knowing if you're lying, but not what part you're lying about, or why you might be lying, as opposed to like, accusatory, like, oh, you're trying to say someone did something, as opposed to like trying to deflect something, or maybe it just makes you uncomfortable, so you lie about it. And that's one of the big things I learned from that is you don't try to assume that you're a body reader. Like even after reading that book, like it's not like you all of a sudden know that this person is lying or this person is angry. It's just more that you know that they're uncomfortable. You know that there's something disconnected between what you're saying and what they're thinking.
Right.
And so yeah, basically, like I said, it's like to sum it all up, as I got towards the end of my career at my previous workplace, that was one of the biggest things I had done was slowly change my mindset, not just understanding how other people work, but understanding how I work. And along that path, I was able to start networking with incredible people. I also had some like amazing opportunities essentially fall into my lap, but because I happened to be sitting in the right spot, right? Like I chose to sit in a different place than I was supposed to be. And because of that, metaphorically. And so because of that, I had things, fall to my lap. And I ended up going to a couple of tech conferences. I ended up meeting with tons of incredible people. I started networking with people on Instagram, that kind of thing. And I started gaining invaluable resources to the point where I ended up taking this online marketing course that ended up recently talking about how, I took it, I think, I don't know, let's say 6 months ago. And one of the things it talked about was when you're networking, like obviously be in a local chamber of commerce, which I am. And one of the other ones was like, try to connect with the BNI. And I hadn't really looked into it much. BNI is a Business Networking International, I think it's called, something like that. But essentially they're local chapters where in that chapter you can only have one person from various industries. And the goal is for you to all get referrals for each other. If you don't get referrals to each other, you can end up getting kicked out. If you don't show up every single week, you can end up getting kicked out. It's very stringent, but it's very powerful. And one of the things they said was whether or not you join one or not, find somebody who's in one and connect with them and try to get in there. And so last week I ended up going to a networking event that actually my dad ended up telling me about. And I go there, I end up networking with one of my dad's friends, and he's part of a BNI group. Ironically, because that got brought up, I found out my dad was part of a BNI group. And so literally this morning, that's where I was. I was actually at a BNI meeting, meeting new people. And because I was a visitor, technically I cannot ask for referrals, but I'm still allowed to give, it's like a 45-second commercial about yourself. And so the other people that are BNI members, they'll give that same commercial, but within there, they'll be like, I'm also looking for maybe single moms who just bought a new home. Something like that. Like they'll be very specific about what they're looking for. But for me, I just got to describe what I do. And so after I was done, I immediately had a few people end up talking to me, even though I did not. I told them what I do and what niche I work in, but not who I'm looking for. So I kind of got around the telling them what I'm looking for by going, I do digital media marketing and social media marketing. I work with Facebook, Instagram. I work with web design, logos, and branding. I described a scenario where I helped restructure a local business, changing their name, changing their website, and through that actually helping them gain more clients. And now they're ranked number one for with the niche that they're in and the local city, and immediately they come up number one, which has gotten them quite a few clients now. Not an excessive amount, not to the degree I'd like, but enough that it's like, oh, like it works. And so I happen to just give that little story, and then I go, so basically I enjoy working with, like, not I'm looking for, but like I enjoy working with fitness, health, nutrition, because I like promoting that, which I do. And so when I sat down immediately, conveniently, I'm also sitting next to a nutritionalist who works for a company that sells health products. And she's like, I've got a bunch of referrals for you. And so I was like, that's incredible. So I collected everyone there's business card, and I'm going to start contacting them actually probably after this interview. Because
so we're holding you back.
Oh, no, don't worry. They're all at work now. So, but yeah, that was a big thing, was the ability to network with people and connect with people, understanding that, a lot of the time people, when they go, I actually hate this. I had a friend of mine do this to me once, and it's very unsettling when it happens, but essentially you should never give anything with the expectation of receiving. One of the books we were talking about last time, and one of the most powerful books on psychology, specifically when it comes to business, is Influence. I think this was written in like the 80s, I believe. It was written a while ago. And it actually took a while to make headway as well, because a lot of marketers and advertisers follow these very specific rules, and they didn't realize that they could be using, essentially psychology to work
psychology in business.
favor. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening is, what ended up happening was there's that law of reciprocity, and this friend of mine is someone who definitely was taught it the wrong way, and essentially was like, hey, here's something for you. I'm like, oh, cool, that's awesome. She's like, by the way, would you be able to do this thing for me? And I'm like, I've already kind of, voiced my opinion on that. I'm not a fan of promoting that. And they're like, oh, I just got this thing for you, and now you're just going to, basically give me the finger. And I'm like, whoa, like you came just offering something, and then you
Yeah.
immediately did the ask. And if anyone here follows Gary Vee, you know that the the code is jab, 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 right hook, and the translation is give, 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 ask, right?
Yeah.
And so you shouldn't go into
Not
anything.
give, expect.
Yeah, well, not only that, it's also not give right hook, right, or jab
Yeah.
right hook. It's
Yeah.
jab 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 right hook. You should always try to give much more than you
Build.
ever even think. Like, even if you want to expect something in return, right? You should never give less than you expect or equal. You should always give more than you would ever expect. But yeah,
Yeah.
and then Gary's biggest thing is don't expect anything. And then if anything happens, it's just gravy, right? Like, you're like, wow, that's awesome. Like, I wasn't expecting you to do anything for me. And ironically, some of the greatest connections I've gotten and some of the greatest things that have happened for me were when I was just giving stuff away. Then I forgot I was helping them. And all of a sudden I
Yeah.
get a response later, like, thanks. Like, that was really awesome. Like, is there something I could do for you? And like, that's tremendous. Like, just the feeling too. Like, you're like,
Yeah.
oh, like, I'm glad that helped you. Like, that's cool. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not really looking for anything, but I guess this is what I'm working on. It's like, oh, well, I have a connection over here, right? And
Yeah.
that's slowly how I started building my network, from not knowing many people at all, especially in bigger businesses, to go into a tech conference, joining a group, actually, it's called Propelify. And what ended up happening was within, I joined them probably in like August, and by maybe February or January, I think I became an admin on their page. Like, it was crazy. Like, just by giving a lot of advice, giving a lot of help, recommending a lot of books. That was one of the big things I kept doing. And I think the final like ask that I got from them was they had asked, like, oh, what was your favorite book from last year? And I was like, oh, Jesus, like, what was my favorite book per category? I could maybe narrow it down that way. And I listed off 6 categories, and like, these were all my favorite books. And I ended up getting connected with the founder of it, like, hey, let's work on this book club. They wanted to start a book club for their organization. So I ended up getting into that. And through that, I met even more people. And ultimately, after I attended the latest event that they held, because they hold one a year at the mid-May, I ended up meeting another person who helped work on the actual event. And after talking with him, he goes, by the way, that whole book club thing, I actually have a connection to Penguin Publishing House, or Penguin Random House, which is a publishing company. Let's see. Oh, the book I'm reading right now, it's over there. It's Drive. That's published by them. And so he was like, I figured that'd be a good connection for you. And I was like, holy crap! Like, I'm gonna connect with somebody from a major publishing company just from giving stuff. I think I ended up doing 3 months of that book club, where I spoke for like anywhere from an hour and a half to 2 hours, just breaking down a book. And there wasn't even many people in the live feed at the time, but a lot of people watched it later, apparently, and were very very much enjoyed it. And I think the final time I did it, I accidentally broke Facebook, so I couldn't. It didn't actually end up sharing it with anyone. So for an hour and a half, I talked to myself, and I wasn't even aware of it until it was all done. And then it turns out the program that was supposed to record it, I forgot to hit the check mark to record it. So not only did I talk to myself for an hour and a half, I couldn't even upload that anywhere later. So I just sat by myself talking for an hour and a half, and it was fantastic.
Yeah.
But one of the other big things I gained from the whole giving without any expectation is one thing a lot of people don't realize, is that whenever you teach someone, you not only first off, if you're going to teach someone, you have to remember everything you learned. So you end up doing a little bit more research just to remember what you learned. But when you
a higher level of learning.
Yeah, once you actually have to explain it to somebody else, you end up, gaining even more knowledge than you originally maintained from the initial read through or learning or
Yeah,
session that you gained
it's
that
the
knowledge.
yeah, it's retaining, like you're saying, retaining rather than just reading the book and having it in your notes or even highlights. The second part of that is actually when you teach it, you go through that process of like almost instantly. I try to teach what I've read. I think I do it subconsciously, but I end up teaching people around me what I've just read. You can't help yourself
Yeah,
when
you're
it's
like,
interesting stuff to
here's all
you.
this stuff in my head. I want someone else to hear it.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
you retain it better when you teach it to people. Definitely, the
yeah.
teacher learns more than the student.
Yeah, and one of the big things I also picked up this one concept I've known for a while because I used to hate some of my professors in college because you could tell they were there for research money and they were terrible teachers. They were definitely professors. And one of the things is that I think this is a quote from Einstein: "If you can't explain it in simple terms, you don't know it well enough." And that was one of the big things I took, was that if I can't teach like my little brother, my little sister, one of the concepts I learned, then maybe I really don't know that concept. Like maybe I have
Yeah,
these random words in my head. So if I go talk at a business meeting, people are like, "Oh, he's smart," but like I wouldn't be able to actually delve deeper into that same subject. And very recently, because I fell prey to one of the cognitive biases, which I know we were talking about before on that other
hmm
call, um,
yeah,
was it was hard for me to explain some of the stuff I knew. A lot of it was like innate. Like I just would do something and it would work because I just knew it. And I wanted to
hmm
be able to start explaining that, because if I ever have to hire somebody to do something that I know, I have to then teach them. And I don't want them to have to spend 3 years
yeah,
reading books to have this revelation and then realize what they needed to learn. I want to be able to break it down much easier for them. And that's the whole point of getting a mentor. It's like you don't want to
yeah,
waste your time trying to learn something someone else already learned. And not only did they learn it, they figured out how to explain it better so you can get it without having to fail. And
yeah.
that latest
Can
book
I
that helped,
add on an
yeah,
extra bit to what you said there because it's quite interesting. It's what I read in a book called How to Read a Book, and he said something very similar to Einstein. He said that if you can't explain the book, the whole as a whole, in your own words, not just in like quotes or what's on the blurb, not just memorizing the blurb, but actually that's what you would ask as students if what was the book about, and then they were like, I'm not very sure. Then they didn't learn the book. So yeah, that's one way to figure out if you could do a book review on a book, then you've learned it.
yeah, and that's huge too, which is probably one of the reasons I really started putting those book posts on Instagram, was that it was almost a way for me to recap what I learned. Because most of those books, like I try to post like the book of the week, although it's not every week. At one point I was reading a book a week, but I wasn't keeping up on my Instagram with that. So like every time I
Yeah,
post a book, it's like, I think my last post was like 6 or 7 books ago, something like that. Yeah. And so like I'm far behind on the books I have already read that I haven't posted. So by the time I have to post them again, I actually have to recap what I learned. And it's been very helpful doing that. But one of the latest books I was getting to was this one, Made to Stick. And this
yeah,
one was incredibly useful for being able to take an idea and then teach somebody it. And
yeah,
it's the whole concept of making an idea sticky. And
yeah,
it's great for like teachers. It's great for like business coaches, for example. If you're trying to teach somebody how to do something, don't give them the raw facts and data. You need to teach them in a way that they will retain that information. And that's a huge deal, because a lot
yeah,
of people, they'll pay like thousands of dollars for some business coach to come in and fix their community for a little bit. They change
yeah,
for like a month and then it goes back to the way it was, and then you have to end up paying that same guy again. And that's why there are some business coaches that are like, yeah, it'll be $100,000 because if I come in, your business will be forever changed. And so
yeah.
that's a big deal for a lot of people, is the ability to remember what the hell was taught to you.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, you've not really read a book if you if you can't retain it. So it's ideally you read less books and retain more, and read them in more depth and get quality reading at time in, and rather than audiobooks can be a good way to learn, but if you're distracted and doing other things, you don't retain it half as well as as you read. Even if you're a better listener, I think having that peace while you're doing it, at least sitting away in silence if you're going to listen to an audiobook, be alone and not doing too much, because you're not retaining it as well. There's maybe these exceptions.
Yeah.
But
Well, that's one of the big reasons they say you should, if you're going to listen to an audiobook, it's good like on the way to work, like you're driving, especially if you have a long commute, because if you're doing that, it's like most of your driving is automatic. So unless someone cuts you
Oh
off
yeah.
or, there's an accident or some holdup, it's usually a lot easier to retain that because everything else you're doing is automatic and you're just putting in knowledge. And even if it's just subconsciously, and that's one of the big things we were talking about last time is the subconscious thoughts, that the more you put in there, eventually, like you might come up with an idea that was a combination of multiple ideas because they've just been floating in your subconscious.
Yeah.
But like I agree though, like the audiobooks, like those first two I picked up, I definitely needed them to be audiobooks. If I got those books, I have the physical books now. There's no way that on the first day of reading, I would have ever have gotten through those books. I wouldn't have gotten through the first chapter. I'd have been like, oh, I'm going to go to sleep now. And so that helped a lot. And then there's other books where, like I'm definitely glad I have the story. Like this has been fantastic. Like I'm glad I can hear it in my own head. Or if there's no audio book that the author reads it, I can read it in the author's voice. And then one of the biggest ones that I've picked up recently is there's a book called Principles by Ray Dalio, probably one of the best business books I've ever read, but it's like 680 pages long. It's massive. And he actually tells you don't have to read the first section because it's basically his life story, but it's interesting, so he included it. He almost didn't, but he did anyways. And then the next section, he's like, read through this thoroughly. These are the principles that I gained from that life experience, and I've created these set of life principles. Right. And then finally, he's like, the final section is called work principles. And these you do not need to read through. They're very monotone, very dry. And because of that, you can use it more like an encyclopedia. Like, oh, I need to help work with an employee or something that's causing problems. Like, there's a section for that. There's principles on that. But I had to give this was one of the books I did for the book review. I think it was actually, or the book club. I think it was actually the first one I did, now that I think about it. And it was, I couldn't get through it. I got through the first 400 pages, and now I'm in that work section. And I'm like, I'm going to pass out. I can't do it.
Yeah.
So
I know what you mean.
So what I ended up doing was I ended up getting Audible. I ended up downloading the book, and I ended up listening to it while reading it. And every once in a while, I'd zone out and I'd be like, oh, what words was I on? Because, again, it was dry. But by doing it that way, it was much easier to absorb that information as well. Like, there's still a lot of stuff I retained from that I normally wouldn't, because I was not only seeing it and physically flipping through the pages, I was hearing it. So, and that's the whole thing, is I'm adding multiple senses, and the more senses you add, the higher the retention rate of whatever it is you're trying to learn, whether it's a physical activity or knowledge based.
Yeah, I heard that your friend Ty Lopez actually say something like that. That it's like putting yourself in I think he was quoting Richard Dawkins, and it's like putting yourself in a virtual or a simulator, and gaining experience from other people's life. Yeah. So like you're saying, the more sort of senses and the ways that you learn that. Like I used a good example when I went to see Grant Cardone live in the conference. Very nice. As well as listening to his audiobooks, as well as reading some of the parts that he teaches in the 10X rule and Sell or Be Sold. So you're spot on there, because you get different senses when you go to see a person live versus audiobooks versus physical books. So you get as close as you can to actually experiencing it yourself.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's also one of the reasons why Gary, he talks about, he puts content out every day. And some people message him going like, you put out the same stuff every day. And he's like, yeah, that's because it's accurate. I'm just trying to get it out there. But he says the reason he does it is that maybe this one time in this one place, you're in the right mindset, maybe because of all these other physical sensations that set you so that when you hear this thing that he's been repeating, all of a sudden you're like, whoa. Kind of
like your paradigm shift.
It's like exactly. I was gonna say, like when I was listening to that audiobook, I was driving to a job that was slowly getting more demoralizing, And so I'm just like, what else do I got to lose? I'm listening to this, and all of a sudden, like, bam, like, obviously people know it's good to read, but nobody reads. Like, when I hear that the average person read one book a year, I was like, I don't think I can list somebody who reads a book at all, like, after I gotten out of high school. So who are these magic people that are outweighing everyone? It must be those CEOs that are reading 60 books, accounting for the extra 59 people that aren't reading. And so, obviously, like, I knew that it was good to read, but I didn't realize what I would actually gain from it. And so, like, that,
Yeah.
I needed that moment where it was auditory, and I was like,
Yeah.
oh, like, that made sense. And, like, that
Yeah.
was
Is
like
that
everything I needed.
another word for paradigm shift, which is the fancy way of saying the aha moment, is when everything that you believe in, or you think, or you do, starts to completely change, and it can happen overnight, like we discussed, or it can happen over a set period of time. So just so people understand, that paradigm shift is that aha moment that you have when you've probably heard it a couple of times from different mentors or teachers or books or audiobooks and radios and things. Then one time someone says almost the same thing in a different context, in a different story that relates more to you, and you're like, oh, I've heard that before, but that makes more sense this time. It's like your dad or your mum or your parents telling you something. You don't. It's like we don't listen to our parents as much as we listen to someone that we respect, like a celebrity or that we know or something. So I just wanted to get that point out, because it was something I wanted to touch on before when you mentioned paradigm shift, so people know exactly what we're talking about there. So it's the aha moment.
Yeah, and that's actually a big one. There's another book I have up on my shelf above my desk. It's called "You Are a Badass" by Jen Sincero. And the thing that's interesting about that is the author says she has a friend who got a tattoo under her arm that says or duh, is DUH, duh. And the reason for that was that every time that you really have like a full, like, so like the difference between just an paradigm shift and an aha moment is that aha moment is that instantaneous paradigm shift where you're like, oh, like, whoa, like everything I thought was different. And what would happen is usually when that happens, you're like, oh, like, right, like you throw your arms
Yeah.
up. And the point was that most aha moments, most paradigm shifts are things that are actually very obvious, but they're super powerful. And so
Mm.
she put duh under her arm. So whenever she'd raise her hands in like disbelief, it was like, oh yeah, that was
Right.
actually pretty obvious. I should have
Yeah.
known that. And then you
Yeah.
laugh it off, but like now it's stuck in there. And ironically, we were talking about this before on the previous call about how one of the greatest ways to retain any information is to have an emotion attached to it. One of the big things that I learned through a lot of the psychology books, as well as books about the physiology of your brain, is that as you're engaging in an activity, if emotion becomes attached to it, the wiring in your brain is much stronger. And so I was talking about the big fish story, where essentially when say your uncle or your grandfather, whatever, they go out and they catch a fish, and they know it was this big, but then they're like, yeah, I caught a fish and it was this big. You're like, yeah, right, grandpa, right? But the next time they go to tell that, what they do is they try to remember how big the fish was. But the thing was, they said it was this big, and they don't remember that. They know they wanted to say the fish was bigger, so they're like, oh yeah, it was this big. And so they're like, yeah, actually the fish was this big. And because what's happening is there wasn't a lot of emotion in the initial catch of the fish. It wasn't a big fish. And so every time they tell the story, though, they're actually creating a new memory for themselves. And so every time it's like, oh yeah, I think the fish was actually this big, so it must have been this big. Like, it's off camera now. It's huge,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that's what happens with your memories, is that every time, like right now, like anyone who's listening or listens later, like if you're like, remember the bike when you're a kid, and you think about it, and there's not a lot of emotion attached. You're like, yeah, I had a bike when I was a kid, and it's like, oh, what color was it, right? Well, if you say the wrong color now, the next time you go to remember it, you're likely to remember this new color you just made up, even if it was never true. And so you're like, yeah, it was purple. And then the next time you're like, yeah, I think it was like a midnight purple. You know what? I think it was like a dark midnight purple with like, I think, scratches of rust in it. And then later you find out the bike was red because you find a picture of it. And you're like, oh, I swear it was purple. And the thing is that it's not that your memory's bad. It's that that's how you actually remembered it. Your memories from your past aren't like unchanging. Like you can change what you think about to the degree where you remember different things. There's been people that have gone to jail over false accusations where later a psychologist broke it down and like turns out like they actually remembered the wrong thing. And so that your brain is very powerful to you, but if you learn to control it, it can be powerful for you. And that's one of the big things that I learned through a lot of this was that like, oh, like if I start to think certain ways, I can change it. And one of the most powerful ways to do that is if you want to have a good memory that causes you to do better things, is you want to attach an emotion to it, because when you do that, it's much harder to change that memory. And it's actually why like people with PTSD, it's very difficult for them to forget it, because anytime they have that memory, it actually re-triggers the emotions as well. And so that's why the only way that you can help someone with PTSD, if you're a psychologist, first off, you should never try it on your own because you can cause bad things. But the point is that the way that they'll do it is they'll bring you back to that memory, and while you're remembering it, they will try to change how you feel about it. And if they can do that, they can then now alter the memory, right? That's how people can like fully recover. Not everyone can, but well, it's not that not everyone can, but maybe not everyone also chooses to. I don't know if everyone can. I'm not a full brain scientist or anything like that. But
very close to a psychologist, though.
But yeah, so like that's a big thing though, is that you can utilize that to your advantage as opposed to only being taken advantage by it. So like that's how a lot of people fall into the victimhood mentality, is they attach this traumatic thing that happened to them, and then they have an emotion on it, and now it's like that's everything. Anytime I think anything about that subject, this full memory appears again, and it overwhelms me, so I can't do anything. As opposed
how can we use that in a positive way? Like I remember you told me something about that, but how can the people listening and watching use that same thing in a positive way?
So one of the things that I did, and I remember talking about this last time, was this book right here, Think and Grow Rich. It's one of the best-selling self-help books ever. It's also one of those ones that's like, oh, Think and Grow Rich. Yeah, money will appear because I thought about it. And obviously it doesn't work that way, but
it's a turn off before, like for people who think about the book cover and what the title is, it might be put off before they've even tried it.
Yeah, exactly. There's a couple of books I've picked up that are like that, where it's like, they're like, oh, how to become rich on the internet. And it's like, oh, wow, yeah, right. But that's probably one of the best books about how to get rich on the internet.
The 4-Hour Work Week is one of my favorite self-help business books. And again, it looks like it's a book for lazy people who want to get into business, but there's a lot of work to be done if you read the book and take it in. It's a very good book. It's one of them as well. It's like 4 hours a week. You can't do that, and they won't bother reading the book. I heard Grant Cardone actually say that. I wouldn't read the book because it's called 4 Hour Work Week.
Yeah, well, the funny thing too is that that book was almost called the 2-Hour Work Week, and he realized he's like, because he actually figured out he was actually only working 2 hours a week, but he's like, man, like that's really not believable. No one's gonna take that. I'm like, if I say 4, I guess that's a little better. And so they had to change the name. And it's funny because I think when he first put it to the publishers, that's what it was he had done like testing to figure out a couple of different names, but one of the names he came up with was the 2-Hour Work Week. And when he put that to them, they're like, yeah, no, like we're not going to publish that book. Because no one's going to buy it. No, why would anyone think that you could work 2 hours a week and live the rich life? And so it is funny. So it's the same with this. This book has that turnoff, but it's one of the most powerful books for self-help. And the one chapter that I go to over and over and over again is the chapter on autosuggestion. I don't actually do what he recommends, which is he actually recommends that you read that one chapter over and over and over again. And it's the chapter of autosuggestion, which essentially is by telling yourself something, you can convince yourself that it's real. And so the whole Think and Grow Rich concept is like, I have $1 million in my bank account, right? It's like, I don't have $1 million in my bank account, but you say that to yourself. You say that over and over again until one day you're just like, I'm a millionaire. Where's my money? Like, what are millionaires supposed to be doing right now? And you start changing what you do based on what you believe. And that's one of the big things that I took away from that. But it actually goes even deeper than that, to the point where, it was the story I was telling you, where I was testing this theory out, like how powerful can it be? And so for about a month straight after reading that book, every night I went to bed, I told myself, all right, I'm going to wake up at 6 a.m. But I didn't just say like that. I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to wake up at 6 a.m. I would like get myself into a state of some form of emotion, whether it was like angry, like I'm going to wake up, or like, there's going to be something awesome tomorrow, I'm going to wake up, or like, almost sad, like I can't let these people down, I got to wake up, right? And so I did that for a month, and it did not matter what time I went to bed. I would set my alarm for 6 a.m. and I would wake up at 5:59, right before the alarm clock would go off every day. There was days I went to bed at 4:30 in the morning and I woke up at 5:59. And it was almost terrifying. I got to the point where I'm like, I'm not even going to do that anymore, because that's a bit unsettling, like how much your brain has control over you. And if you tell it the right thing, it can do some powerful things. And that's why you get, that's also why you can get people that are like, psychopathic, not necessarily sociopath, because that can be a physiological thing, but psychopathic because they tell themselves some pretty crazy things. But then there's also the flip side of that, where most people who become successful tell you that in order to become successful, you actually have to be crazy enough to believe it can happen.
Yeah.
Right. And so
that's it's like what we were talking about. We originally started that conversation because I was reading a lot about Eckhart Tolle on the ego, and I was trying to get over the question of, is the ego, like, it felt like the ego is a negative thing, and your ego is your false sense of self, or your identity that you have for yourself, and based on your past. So like, I asked you the question, is the ego just a negative thing that we need to completely get rid of? But then you came up with a great idea about using, because we can't fully get rid of ego, because that makes us humans, as one of my mentors said. So you can manipulate your ego in a positive way to make positive actions, because you create a better identity of yourself in your mind, which results in those actions.
Yeah. Essentially your ego is just the accumulation of thoughts that you've had that have now created what is an identity. Trying to remember what book. Actually, do I have that one over here? Yeah, there's Tribes. I'm not gonna pick it up because now it's underneath all of those books, and I'm gonna knock something over. But most people put themselves into some category. It's actually the whole reason why we have, like, huge tensions in the state right now, and actually in a lot of other countries in the world, is that people put themselves into a category of what they think they are. Like, oh, I'm an athlete, or oh, I'm the nerd, right? Like that kind of thing. And by doing that, you limit what you think you can do. And so that's also the same reason why people fight with each other, because they're like, no, this is how it is because this is what this identity tells me it is, as opposed to, oh, well, maybe that identity is useful sometimes, but not for this. Like, maybe an athlete's not the best person to be a brain surgeon, right? Like, it's not that
Could
they
I
couldn't
add a
be.
wee bit?
Yeah.
Just to label that, it's a limiting belief, as Tony Robbins labels that idea. It's a good way to explain that. It's a limiting belief.
Exactly. And it's funny because, like, it's not so much that you think you can't do it. It's just that you think you're someone who can't do it. And that's a huge distinction, because so many people, they're like, oh, like I could never do that. It's like, I could never be a pro basketball player. It's like, what are you talking about? There's people that are like 5'4" that are pro basketball players. Like, that's crazy. Like, right? They obviously have amazing competitors, but like, there's people that don't meet the the cookie cutter identity that you would picture for various tasks or abilities, and yet they still do it. And that's because they create an identity around themselves where they're like, this is what I do, right? Like, I am this person, and I am capable of these things. And one of the best people to follow on that is, I mentioned before, Tom Bilyeu, the co-founder of was it Quest
Impact
Nutrition,
theory?
and then eventually Impact Theory. And his whole goal with that is to break people out of the matrix. It's to instead of thinking like, oh, like I'm supposed to go to school, then I go to college, then I get a job, and if I save enough money, I can retire, at the age of like death, because of nobody's getting paid enough to be able to retire early enough, and because there won't be any money for you by the time you get there if you follow the normal path, right? And so people like then it's like, oh, well, you could open your own business. And then it's like, well, I'm not one of those people. It's like, what do you mean one of those people? Like, that's a belief of your identity that just doesn't match this potential new identity.
Yeah, you
And
can't. Yeah, it's holding you back from getting through that. Is a belief.
yeah,
That's all it
absolutely.
is. Yeah.
Yeah, and so what a lot of books will do, and actually, like you were saying, the was it A New World?
A new earth. Yeah.
A New Earth, that's what it was. Yeah. You're talking about how it kind of sounds like you should like avoid your ego, like push it to the side. But the thing is that I believe a lot of Stoic philosophers kind of have a similar take on that, where they say like, you're going to have these things you want to do, but be strong enough not to do them. But that's good for when you want to do something so unbelievable. Like there's some people that are like, I want to. Actually, a great example of that Propelify event that I went to this past year. Tons of stuff went wrong right before, the week before the event, that should have made it almost impossible to get pulled off. And because a bunch of people were able to be like, no, we got to get it done, as opposed to like sticking to their ego going, no, like everything was supposed to work this way because I'm an entrepreneur that does it this way and I was prepared and I did all the right stuff. And instead of falling prey to that, they were like, nope, switch modes. Now I'm in control. I'm going to make sure that I finish everything that I said I was going to finish, right? And so that's why it's good to be able to fight against your ego when it might hold you back. And the cool thing about that is if you can actually fight past that, you can potentially alter your ego as well. You can actually get it to the point where your ego is like, oh, I guess that is something we can do, check, right? And now you have another barrier you can break through. But what a lot of people do try to do is they try to just strong arm it through that. But then the problem, that's how people who try to lose weight and then gain it all back fall prey to that. They don't try to tell themselves, like what they do is they fight their ego and they're like, oh, I'm just going to go to the gym every day even though I hate it. As opposed to going, man, I love the gym. Even if you're lying to yourself, it's like, I'm someone who loves going to the gym. Not just I do love the gym, or not I go to the gym. I'm someone who goes to the gym. And by slowly altering your identity, even if it's false at first, that's the whole fake it till you make it. Like you can't really, put on a suit and walk into a business and be like, yeah, I know how to do accounting. But if you want to be someone who can learn to do accounting, then you have to switch that part of your identity. And so that's the biggest takeaway I got from a lot of the the self-help or self-improvement or the psychology or even physiology books, was like, these are how you alter your mind to the point where you can start doing things that at one point your past self wouldn't even believe you were capable of. And it's not just because when you have all that willpower, you're able to fight against your ego. It's because you've actually been able to alter that identity that's been holding you back to something else.
And I've got something to add on to that. Is on top of that, when you surpass that section of your ego that's holding you back, that's almost collective, like the people around you will have very similar identities and beliefs about how things work and how far you can go. But if you think of the mindset of people, the super successful people, they've obviously changed how they do things from the norm. And I've started to push beyond what I used to believe in and what was holding me back and what holds the majority of people back. And I noticed just the other day that I mentioned my new challenge that I'm on, at getting up at 4:45, and I always wondered how the Rock got up at like 4 in the morning and things. And I thought, no, I'm going to get up at the same time as the Rock, just to challenge myself, because I believe in all this stuff as well. And I was like, no, I'm going to take on the Rock. Or like I've said before, like I read about the ancient Greeks and things, so I get quite competitive in the way that like they're just human. Why can't we do it? So I look at things like that in that way, with my beliefs of all the changing my limiting beliefs or removing them. And it's limitless once you get to that stage. And people around you will still try to pull you down because you've got these new beliefs. So you have to defend yourself of that as well, and make sure that you're shining the light on like your ego, and what is this what's holding us back, or is this like the people around us bringing that back into our mind, that no, you might pass out, Ben, if you get up at 4:45 every morning. Like I've had that fed into my mind over the last 10 days. You're going to end up passing out, you're going to die. But there's these things that will hold you back. Once you even overcome it, you've then got these extra hurdles. So watch out for that as well, those 5 people you spend the most time with. it's very true. And be careful about the advice you take in as well, because you're going to take in some subconsciously, even if you've got your hands over your ears. So I just wanted to add that on as well, that there's that exterior side of it as well, as because you can feed yourself as much as possible, you're going to have the influence around you as well. So look out for that.
Yeah, and actually one of the things you said that's really important too is that it's one of the mind. So like obviously like the next question may be like what mindset do you need to have in order to change what you do, and that's there's a book called Mindset by Carol Dweck, and what that talks
Yep.
about is instead of viewing yourself as a fixed identity, such as I am an intelligent person or I am an athlete, the other thing you can do to drastically alter how willing your brain is to accept a new identity, as well as how willing you are to do something new, is to, instead of saying, like I said, I'm the smartest person, say I'm someone who can learn. I'm not the athlete, but I'm someone who can train and get stronger, right? Like, so that's a big thing I see a lot of people do, is that they try to convince themselves that they're the best at something. So as opposed to going, I'm a millionaire, it's I'm someone who can acquire wealth, right? That's more the
Yeah.
growth mentality as opposed to a fixed mentality. Because what happens if you reach the $1 million mark, right? You've reached there and then you're stuck because you're a millionaire, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then how are you going to
Yeah.
become the next, like Elon Musk or something like that, right? So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
that's the way that you can get around that. But sometimes it helps to, like I said, just give yourself a goal identity of like, I'm going to be a millionaire, because it's too hard to like believe like, oh, I can learn all this stuff. But like, if there's anyone who thinks they can't become a millionaire in 60 to 80 years, however long you're going to live, right? Like, or 100 years, like I plan on living into my hundreds. So like, that's my thing. Like, if you don't think you can at one point achieve $1 million, you've already got something else you got to solve first, right? Like you've got way too limiting a belief, because most people, if they just simply, if you just have a smart investment portfolio, like there's been people that worked at like UPS that have retired millionaires at the age of 40 just by not spending a lot of money and investing in the right things. So like it's not
Yeah.
something that's like an impossible thing that you have to invent something new. Like you can do that just working. So
Yeah.
so like that's a huge thing that a huge hurdle a lot of people have to get over, and that's why these books are great examples. Not every book has the same impact, but like a lot of the ones actually coincidentally that Made to Stick actually explained explained the reason why some of the books I've read, I remember almost everything from them. And one of the big reasons is because they were told in some story format. They weren't like, here's a bunch of facts. They were like, hey, here's a lot of interesting information and here's a story about it.
The
And here's
context.
how
Yeah.
it's not just context as much as your brain literally, like, as we evolved, we would tell stories around a campfire. Like that's how we translated knowledge before there was written word, before there was books, right? Like we had to communicate and share knowledge in order to advance our society and civilization anyways. And the way that we did that was through storytelling. So our brains are actually designed to like want to hear a story. In fact, actually, what was it? I can't remember if it was Influence or Robert Cialdini's newest book. I think it might have been this one called Persuasion. I think it was this
Mm-hmm.
one. What he would do is he realized that story is one of the most powerful ways to impact people. And so what he would do is at the start of his lecture, he would tell the beginning of a story that his class would then teach. And at the end of the class, he'd finish the story. And one day, he's going through his class and he realizes he didn't finish the story as the bell goes off. And he's like, oh, okay, I'll finish it later. But then all of a sudden he realizes no one's been standing up, no one's been packing their bag like they normally do, watching the clock, ready to leave. And they're like, no, finish the story. Like, you can't just leave us hanging like that. Like, what are you, out of your mind? Is it going to sit with me all day like that? People love stories because it's literally innate. It's built into our
Yeah.
the way that our brains are shaped and mapped is that we love hearing stories. And that's
Yeah.
why obviously there's some limitations to that. Some stories suck. But as long as
Mm-hmm.
they have a certain set of guidelines and rules to the stories, they can be highly impactful. And so the books that have made the most difference to me, And the ones that I've retained the most knowledge from are the ones that are great at storytelling.
Yeah, yeah. I think it was something like, people will never forget how you made them feel, and it's really true. And you can do that through heartfelt stories. But there was something you said there that I wanted to touch on as well. That for example, there's a book called Story Brand, Building Your Story Brand. Donald Miller, I think his name is.
Miller,
It's
yeah, I think
a
it's
recent
Miller.
yeah. He's got a really good book on that, and like the reasons why we must tell stories like Walt Disney done with his movies, and have
Yeah.
that kind of plot of the baddie, the goodie, and then, like you're saying, that cliffhanger moment that people want to find out how this is going to end. Is the guy going to die, or is the guy going to overcome the problem, which is the baddie, and live happily ever after, which we all kind of want to see. But he was kind of saying, like, bringing this into a business perspective, is you then make the customer in that story, which you can use as a case study. Your customer was then the hero, and your company and brand becomes the guide for that. And that was kind of the idea of that book, and it's kind of bringing that in because it's a book I've been listening to recently. It's on my mind. And on top of that, you said stories is what's ingrained to us, and it makes sense because I think the Bible and everything, there's a lot of mythology,
Yeah.
and our history is kind of screwed up because of that in a lot of ways, because they brought the lessons of life into myths and made up people. Who knows if Jesus was a person or not? And there's a lot of, supposedly in Wikipedia, he was a real life figure. He was a person and a historical figure, but there's lots of things against that as well. So it's mythology's been a servant and a bit of a disaster for our history, but
Oh
they
yeah.
used that so that people learned the lessons in the right way by telling stories and giving it context and feeling around this one principle, like Ray Dalio's book.
Yeah, well, what is it? The story of Odysseus, for example, like that was passed on for generations without ever being written down. And so there's no way that that's the full story or even the original story. But usually what will happen is as somebody tells a story, there's certain points that are very like you won't forget this because it's a very important part of the story. Just like like if I tell you a story, right, and then you go to tell someone else that story, you're not going to tell it verbatim. That's impossible. No one's brain's that perfectly, or that good
It's
at
like your fish
remembering something
story,
perfect. Yeah, exactly. Except that
Chinese whispers.
the only difference though, as opposed to potentially getting the bigger fish, what you're doing is you're getting all the right details. Like it was a green fish. It had like this weird fin because that was the part that was important for the story, right? And so it's the important parts that got remembered, and that's one of the reasons they expect that the story of Odysseus is such a great story, is that all of the fluff. Like if anyone's a Dragon Ball Z fan, like those 8 episodes of someone charging up, it's like, we've got it. Like, go attack that person, right? Like, go fight him.
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
only like the best stuff was saved in that story. And so when you hear that story, you're like, wow, that stuff was incredible, because it's
yeah.
all of the best stuff, all the best information from that
I see.
story told in the best way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Right, Dylan, I think we're going to have to close it up. I don't know how much memory Facebook can take from us, but I could listen
Yeah.
for hours, and I'm sure you've got lots more to share, but we could maybe do a take two, which I'd love to do. So anyone
Absolutely.
that's been listening, thanks for everyone that's come on live and maybe had to leave us, and whoever's watching the replay. If you do have any questions for myself or Dylan, send them in the comments below, and we'll try and get round to answer them in the comments or in a follow-up, because there's lots we can share, and you can pick at Dylan's mind. So this will be in Ben's Business Book Club and produced onto iTunes and SoundCloud and everything else in audio form as well as video. So thanks for everyone who's come online. Thank you, Dylan, for sharing everything. You've done
Thanks for having me.
you practice what you preach by giving us so much, and it'll definitely come back to you. there's a lot of new things I've learned today, so I'm sure other people listening in have learned a ton.
Yeah, like I said, thanks for having me.